All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely always up for a good deep dive.
This one's going to stay with you. It's one of those cases, that kind of gets under your skin a bit. We're talking Anneliese Michel.
Oh yeah, that's a heavy one for sure.
We're going to try and untangle it, all the layers, and we're going to use her Wikipedia entry to guide us along the way.
Sounds good. Always good to have a solid roadmap for these things.
Absolutely. And it's not just the exorcisms themselves, right? I mean, it's all tangled up with mental health, with faith, with the culture of the time. Like, how do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's like how much was the understanding of the human mind, especially back then, how much did that play a role?
Hmm.
In the context of such strong religious belief, it's fascinating, but it's also really, really troubling.
Okay, so the Wikipedia entry starts with, her upbringing in Germany, devout Catholic family, seemingly normal childhood. Then she turns 16, and it's like a switch flips. Severe seizures, diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy. I mean, could you break that down for us a little? What's happening in the brain when we talk about temporal lobe epilepsy?
So temporal lobe epilepsy, it's not just about the seizures themselves. It can cause these really intense hallucinations, altered states of consciousness. And you got to think back then, trying to separate those experiences from deeply held religious beliefs, it must have been incredibly difficult. I mean, it's a tough area even now, with all our advances.
Oh, absolutely. I'm already thinking, how often did doctors even consider that connection back then? Like someone comes in describing these visions, and maybe it's a medical symptom, but maybe it's a spiritual crisis, or maybe it's both.
Yeah, and treatment options back then were way more limited. You're a doctor in the 70s, a patient is talking about demons. What do you even do with that?
Wow. And it just keeps getting more complicated. After the epilepsy diagnosis, depression, treatment at a psychiatric hospital, nothing seems to help. And then her symptoms get really intense. She's seeing devil faces, hearing voices telling her she's damned, and she can't stand to be around religious objects. I mean, considering her upbringing, it's jarring, right?
It's incredibly jarring. Think about the internal conflict, the dissonance of someone so devout suddenly pushing away the very symbols of their faith. It's not just a change in behavior, it's like a deep, visceral rejection of everything she knew.
And then comes the pilgrimage to San Damiano in Italy. This feels like a real turning point. Things really shift here. She can't even be near religious symbols. She feels like the ground is burning, sees people gnashing their teeth. I mean, what's going on here?
You're right. The escalation is so important here. It's not just internal anymore. It's impacting her interactions with the world around her. The environment becomes hostile. And then there's the mention of stigmata.
Oh, yeah, the wounds, like Christ's crucifixion. Talk about adding fuel to the fire. Stigmata has always been such a mysterious phenomenon. What could be happening there psychologically?
Well, it's a bit of a minefield, to be honest. It could be psychosomatic, extreme belief manifesting physically. But then there's also, well, the unexplained. It's impossible to say for sure, especially in a case as complex as this.
Right. And at this point, her family, seeing all this, they become convinced it's demonic possession. It must have been so desperate, seeing their daughter suffer and not knowing what to do. So they reach out to priests for help. But the Catholic Church, they don't just jump into exorcisms, right?
No, not at all. Think of it as like an investigation. They have a whole protocol, got to rule out any medical, any psychological explanation. And even then, the bishop needs to approve it. It's a huge decision.
So even with the family so convinced, the Church is still hesitant, recommends sticking with medical treatment.
Yeah.
But then things get even darker. And I apologize, some of this is pretty hard to hear. But Anneliese's behavior, it just gets more and more disturbing. Aggression, she's hurting herself, even eating insects. It's horrifying.
It's really hard to even imagine the level of distress that must have been present. And remember, she's still under medical care for epilepsy and other things. Are these behaviors part of her illness or a reaction to the treatments or something else entirely? We just don't know.
It's like each piece of this puzzle, instead of making things clearer, it just makes the bigger picture even more confusing.
It really does. It's a lot to process for sure.
So what happens next? Does the Church finally agree to an exorcism?
Well, they do, eventually. But it's not a decision they take lightly. There's a lot more to uncover there, and we'll get into that in the next part of our deep dive.
I mean, it's hard to imagine how everyone must have been feeling. Her family, the Church, it just sounds so desperate.
Yeah, it was a really, really tough situation all around. You have her family seeing her getting worse and worse, and then the church, they're trying to figure out what to do. And of course, Annalise herself, caught in the middle of all of it.
So they do eventually authorize an exorcism, but what did that even look like back then?
Well, it's 1975. The whole thing, the ritual itself was very secretive, which, just adds another layer to an already really complex case. The Wikipedia entry, it says there were 67 exorcism sessions over 10 months. Some of them, they lasted up to 4 hours.
67. Wow. That's a lot. I mean, that had to take a toll, right? Physically and psychologically.
You would think so. It's just hard to imagine.
And, thinking back to what you were saying earlier about the power of suggestion, especially when someone is already so vulnerable,
hmm
how much do you think those factors played a role in all of this?
Well, think about it. She's already physically and emotionally exhausted. Her sense of reality is probably already really fragile because of her illness. Then on top of that, she's going through these ancient rituals, this huge weight of authority from the church and the belief of everyone around her. It's a lot to handle. The impact of all that, it can't be ignored.
Right. And the Wikipedia entry talks about some really disturbing behavior during those sessions. The growling, the aggression, the self-harm. Even says she talked about atoning for the sins of others. Is there any way to, understand what might be going on there? Psychologically, I mean.
It's a question that still haunts this whole case. Dissociation, maybe, like a mental splitting off to cope with all the trauma. And then you also have the religious context. Her belief system is telling her this is a spiritual battle. So her pronouncements, maybe that was a way of making sense of what was happening, finding meaning in all the suffering.
Then, July 1st, 1976, Anneliese dies, 23 years old. Malnutrition, dehydration. She basically starved to death.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking. And like we've been talking about, if she had received medical care, this probably wouldn't have happened. What happened next? Was there a trial?
There was. And the trial, it wasn't just about whether someone was guilty or not. It forced people to think about some really big questions, like where's the line between religious practice and negligence? How can we balance the right to believe something with the responsibility to protect people? Really tough questions.
The Wikipedia entry mentions that doctors testified. It said that her epilepsy and, the psychological impact, how she was raised, that all explained her symptoms. But then the defense, they played recordings from the exorcisms, and they said those recordings had demonic voices on them. And they said that right before Anneliese died, she was freed.
Yeah. Those recordings, they're more than just evidence in a trial. They're a look into a deeply troubled mind. You listen to them, and it's really sad. But they also became this point of disagreement. Science versus faith. How do you explain something like this?
In the end, both the parents and the priests, they were found guilty of negligent homicide, but they got suspended sentences. No jail time, it seems like. Kind of a complicated verdict.
Yeah, it is. It's like they were trying to find a balance, acknowledging that something terrible happened and that people were responsible, but also understanding the role that faith played in their decisions. It's not a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's about how humans make mistakes and about faith and honestly, about how much we still don't understand.
It's a lot to take in. So how did the church respond after all of this?
It was a big moment for them, too, for sure. A lot of people were criticizing them. Bishop Stangl, the one who okayed the exorcisms, he said he didn't realize how bad Annaliese's health was. But eventually, the church admitted that mental illness was probably the real issue, not demonic possession.
That's a huge shift, isn't it? To actually acknowledge that mental illness was a factor? I wonder how much this case changed the church's views on exorcisms.
It's hard to say definitively, but the Wikipedia entry does mention that there were fewer official exorcisms in Germany after this. Maybe it made them think more carefully, be more cautious in situations like this, especially when mental health is a concern.
It also mentions that they exhumed her body 2 years later. Her parents requested it. Why did they do that?
Kind of a sad detail. Apparently, she was buried pretty quickly in a simple coffin,
Right.
and they wanted to give her a proper burial, one last act of love for their daughter.
The reports say her body decomposed normally, but her grave, it became a pilgrimage site for some Catholics who believed she was a martyr, that she suffered to atone for other people's sins.
Which just goes to show you how powerful belief can be. Even after she's gone, people are still interpreting her story in different ways. Was it mental illness, spiritual torment, or both? We still don't know.
So much to unpack. And it feels like, even now, there are more questions than answers.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. We've gone way beyond just the facts on Wikipedia, and we've really tried to make sense of this incredibly complicated story.
It really is unsettling to think about how one case, one person's story, can have so many different interpretations. Even after all these years, there's something about Annaliese's experience that just keeps drawing people in.
Right. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We've really tried to get beneath the surface here, going beyond just what the Wikipedia entry says, and grapple with all the complexities of this case.
We've looked at the medical side, the spiritual side, the legal battle, what the culture was like back then. But there's another piece here we can't ignore, the human element.
Absolutely. I mean, at the center of all of this is a young woman who died way too young, and a family struggling with this incredible grief and all these questions that just don't have answers.
It's been, what, over 50 years now since Annalise died. And people are still so captivated by her story. I mean, you see in movies like The Exorcism of Emily Rose and Requiem. Both of those were inspired by her case.
Yeah, and it's not just about the horror aspect either. Those movies and Annalise's story itself, they kind of tap into something deep inside us, the whole idea of good versus evil, fear of the unknown, trying to find some meaning when we suffer. It's all there.
It's a powerful reminder, too, of how the lines between faith and reality can get blurred and how dangerous that can be, as we've seen.
For sure. It underscores the need for compassion, critical thinking, and a sense of balance. We need to respect people's beliefs, absolutely, but we also have a responsibility to protect those who might be vulnerable.
So where does this leave us after our deep dive into the life and death of Anneliese Michel? It feels like we have even more questions than when we started.
Maybe. But I think we're left with a story that really challenges us to look at our own beliefs about the human mind, about faith, about what we can and can't understand. It's a reminder to approach these tough, complicated situations with empathy, with careful thought, and with a real desire to find the truth, even when it's hard to find.
This has been a heavy conversation, but a really important one. I think it shows us that even in the darkest parts of human experience, there are still things we can learn and questions that are worth asking.
Absolutely. We hope that this deep dive has encouraged you to keep thinking critically about these kinds of issues and to engage with them in a way that's meaningful to you.
Thanks for joining us. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.